In August 1944, an entire German army tried to escape through a gap, only a few kilometers wide, under constant air attack and collapsing command. Tens of thousands made it out, but even more did not. What really happened inside the closing jaws of the Falaise pocket is far more complex than victory or defeat. By the summer of 1944, the military balance in Western Europe had shifted decisively following the Allied landings in Normandy on the 6th of June. Operation Overlord established a large multinational bridgehead on the French coast, bringing approximately 156,000 Allied troops ashore on the first day and opening a sustained logistical pipeline from Britain into occupied France. Within weeks, the beachhead expanded into a continuous front stretching across Normandy. German defensive forces, primarily Army Group B under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, faced a growing numerical and material disadvantage that could not be fully offset by local reinforcements. The German defense in Normandy relied on a combination of static infantry divisions, mobile armored units, and improvised fortifications constructed under constant air attack. Many formations were understrength following losses on the Eastern Front in earlier campaigns. Fuel shortages limited operational flexibility, while Allied air superiority severely restricted German movement by day. Rail networks were heavily damaged by strategic bombing, isolating frontline units from efficient resupply. Despite these constraints, the German command aimed to contain the Allied lodgment long enough to reorganize its mobile reserves for a decisive counteroffensive. Allied strategic priorities in July 1944 focused on breaking out of the constricted Normandy battle zone. British and Canadian forces were engaged in heavy fighting around Caen, tying down large German armored formations. To the west, the United States First Army prepared a major breakthrough effort near St. Lo. This dual-axis pressure was designed to fracture the German front and exploit mobility advantages once open terrain could be reached. On the 25th of July, 1944, the United States launched Operation Cobra, a concentrated aerial and ground offensive aimed at rupturing the German defensive line west of St. Lo. Following an intense bombing campaign involving more than 3,000 aircraft, American armored and infantry units achieved a rapid breakthrough. Within days, U.S. forces advanced deep into the German rear areas, threatening to envelop German units still engaged with British and Canadian forces to the east. The German response involved the rapid commitment of available mobile forces in an attempt to restore a continuous front. On August 7th, Hitler authorized a counteroffensive near Mortain, intended to sever the American corridor and cut off U.S. forces advancing south toward Avranches. This operation committed elements of 4 panzer divisions, but unfolded under overwhelming Allied air attack. The counteroffensive failed within days, further degrading German armored strength in Normandy. As Allied forces pushed east and south in the aftermath of the failed Mortain operation, the possibility of a large-scale German encirclement began to emerge. Canadian and British forces advanced south from the Caen sector, while American formations moved east from the Avranches area. The gap between these advancing Allied armies narrowed around the towns of Falaise, Troon, and Chambois. Within this shrinking corridor, significant elements of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army remained concentrated. At the political level, both Allied and German leadership recognized the potential implications of a full encirclement. For the Allies, the destruction of major German field forces in Normandy would accelerate the liberation of France and open the route toward the German frontier. For the German command, preserving an escape corridor for trapped units became a priority in order to avoid the total collapse of the Western Front. Civilian populations inside the emerging pocket were exposed to some of the most intense combat conditions in Western Europe. French towns along the encirclement zone suffered repeated artillery bombardment and air attack, while mass displacement occurred as residents attempted to escape advancing fronts. Agricultural areas were devastated by armor maneuvers, shell fire, and vehicle traffic. By early August 1944, the strategic and operational conditions necessary for the formation of the Falaise pocket were firmly established. Two opposing operational concepts collided within a limited geographic space: Allied pursuit and German withdrawal. Whether the encirclement would close completely and what its final consequences would be remained unresolved as the converging forces approached one another. In early August 1944, the operational focus in Normandy shifted rapidly from static positional fighting to accelerated movement warfare. Following the breakthrough achieved by Operation Cobra, American armored and infantry formations advanced at a pace that far exceeded previous expectations. By August 1st, U.S. units had reached Avranches, opening the gateway from the Normandy bocage into the open terrain of Brittany and the French interior. This rupture ended the German ability to contain the Allied advance within a narrow coastal zone. On August 1st, Allied command activated the United States Third Army under the command of General George S. Patton. The new formation immediately began a rapid exploitation toward the south and east. Mechanized columns advanced along multiple axes, bypassing isolated German resistance points rather than eliminating them. This operational tempo overwhelmed German rear area security units and disrupted already fragile command coordination. German command structures attempted to stabilize the situation by redistributing remaining mobile reserves. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, faced operational paralysis caused by conflicting directives from higher authorities. The German High Command demanded offensive action to restore the front, while local commanders recognized the vulnerability of their forces to envelopment under constant Allied air observation. On 7th August 1944, Hitler personally authorized Operation Lüttich, a counteroffensive launched near the town of Mortain. The operation's objective was to strike westward from Mortain toward Avranches, sever the American breakthrough corridor, and cut off U.S. forces that had advanced into Brittany. The German attack force included elements of 4 panzer divisions, notably the 2nd Panzer Division, 1st SS Panzer Division, 2nd SS Panzer Division, 116th Panzer Division. The counteroffensive began under conditions unfavorable to its execution. Allied air supremacy remained uncontested. Once German armored formations moved into daylight, they became targets for continuous attack by Allied fighter bombers operating from forward airfields in Normandy. Within the first 48 hours, German armored units suffered heavy vehicle losses from airstrikes alone, severely limiting the offensive's operational reach. American ground forces, supported by extensive artillery networks, halted the German attack along multiple defensive lines. German units achieved limited initial penetrations near Mortain, but failed to exploit them due to insufficient infantry support, fuel shortages, and heavy aerial attrition. By August 11th, Operation Lüttich had failed to achieve its operational objectives and was terminated. The collapse of the German counteroffensive had immediate strategic consequences. With German armored reserves depleted, Allied maneuver formations began advancing eastward without facing organized mobile resistance. U.S. forces pressed toward Argentan and Alençon, while British and Canadian units renewed their offensive south of Caen to drive toward Falaise. On August 8th, Canadian forces launched Operation Totalize, a mechanized night assault supported by heavy bomber strikes aimed at breaking through German defenses north of Falaise. The operation introduced new armored tactics and succeeded in advancing several kilometers beyond previous front lines. Although tempo fluctuated under German counterattacks, the northern axis of the developing encirclement began to solidify. As American forces moved east from the west and Canadian units advanced south from the north, the German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army found themselves increasingly compressed into a narrowing operational corridor. German formations withdrew under pressure, abandoning heavy equipment and relying on secondary road networks to maintain cohesion. By mid-August, the central Norman battlefield had transformed into a pursuit zone. German resistance remained determined but disorganized. Supply lines collapsed under Allied air interdiction. Fuel and ammunition shortages forced repeated vehicle abandonment. Communications between German units deteriorated as signal infrastructure was destroyed during continuous retreats. The geographic focal point of these converging movements centered on the towns of Falaise, Troon, and Chambois. This area now represented the only viable withdrawal route for large German formations attempting to escape destruction. Whether that corridor would remain open and for how long became the defining operational question of the campaign's second phase. By mid-August 1944, the strategic intent of both Allied and German commands centered on a single operational question: whether the converging advances around Falaise could be transformed into a complete encirclement, or whether German forces could still conduct an organized withdrawal. The outcome depended less on overall numerical strength than on timing, coordination, terrain control, and the diminishing mobility of the German formations trapped between the Allied pincers. For the Allied command, the strategic goal was the destruction of Army Group B's primary maneuver elements in Normandy. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force viewed the encirclement not merely as a tactical victory, but as an opportunity to remove the core of German field strength in the West. This objective aligned with broader strategic priorities: accelerating the liberation of France, preventing the Germans from stabilizing a new defensive line on the Seine, and opening a direct operational corridor toward the German frontier before winter. Operational planning within the Allied coalition reflected these priorities. The United States First and Third Armies were tasked with driving east and northeast from the Argentan-Alençon axis. Their objectives included seizing river crossings, cutting off eastbound German withdrawal routes, and linking with British and Canadian forces advancing from the Caen-Falaise sector. The British Second Army and Canadian First Army, reinforced by large armored formations, were directed to press southward against entrenched German positions north of Falaise, regardless of immediate losses, in order to compress the enemy corridor. Allied logistics favored sustained pressure. By August, the Normandy supply system had matured into a high-capacity network of beachheads, artificial harbors, and rapidly repaired ports. More than 20,000 tons of supplies per day flowed into the lodgment area. This allowed Allied commanders to commit armored and infantry divisions continuously without operational pauses for resupply. Fuel shortages that plagued German units did not constrain Allied maneuver planning. German strategic planning during this phase operated under far more restrictive conditions. Army Group B faced progressive fragmentation of its force structure. The 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army had lost cohesion following the Mortagne counteroffensive. Many divisions operated at less than 40% of authorized strength. Armored losses reduced available fighting vehicles to scattered elements rather than unified regimental groupings. Nevertheless, the German objective shifted decisively toward preservation of core manpower and the avoidance of total encirclement. German command planning emphasized the maintenance of an eastward escape corridor through the Trun-Chambois axis. Orders from higher command directed that all available units not engaged in immediate defensive combat attempt to disengage and move east. Rearguard formations were tasked with delaying Allied advances along key road junctions and river crossings in order to buy time for the bulk of forces to withdraw. However, central coordination of this withdrawal was severely compromised. Allied air interdiction destroyed road networks, bridges, and vehicle concentrations throughout daylight hours. Rail transport was no longer viable. Fuel supplies were insufficient to sustain continuous movement of mechanized units. German convoy movement was forced into nighttime windows that reduced overall throughput and created chaotic congestion at key choke points. At the tactical level, terrain played a decisive role in shaping planning assumptions. The area between Falaise and the Dives River consisted of rolling farmland segmented by narrow roads, small villages, and wooded ridgelines. This terrain favored the attacker in artillery dominance, but favored the defender in delaying actions. German units repeatedly attempted to establish temporary blocking positions on elevated ground to slow Allied armored thrusts, knowing that full defensive stabilization was no longer achievable. Political pressure compounded German operational difficulties. Hitler issued repeated orders forbidding full withdrawal beyond designated holding lines, even as local commanders warned that continued delay risked complete encirclement. This disconnect between strategic directive and battlefield reality further disrupted German planning coherence during the critical days when the pocket was forming. By 14th August 1944, the strategic plans on both sides had fully crystallized into opposing imperatives. The Allies sought closure and destruction, the Germans sought delay and escape. The next phase would determine whether timing and coordination favored one objective over the other within the narrowing geographic limits of the emerging Falaise pocket. The first large-scale engagements directly tied to the formation of the Falaise pocket began in the period from 14 to 16 August 1944. During these days, Canadian and Polish formations advancing from the north and American armored units pressing from the south and west entered sustained contact with German rearguard forces attempting to hold open the shrinking withdrawal corridor. The fighting shifted from maneuver into contested penetration along multiple parallel axes. Canadian forces advancing south from the Caen sector encountered heavy resistance from German infantry, and remaining armored elements positioned along successive defensive lines north of Falaise. Operation Totalize, launched earlier, had created the initial breach, but renewed German counterattacks slowed further progress. German units used improvised defensive groupings, supported by self-propelled guns and remaining artillery, to hold key villages and ridgelines. These positions were not intended for long-term defense, but served as delay points to allow withdrawal traffic to pass through behind them. On August 14th, Canadian and Polish units renewed their advance toward Falaise with heavy armor and infantry support. The fighting around the town itself was characterized by street-to-street engagements and prolonged artillery exchanges. German forces attempted to hold Falaise as a blocking position for as long as possible. However, sustained armored pressure and air attack forced a gradual German withdrawal south of the town during the following 48 hours. Simultaneously, American forces of the United States Third Army expanded their eastward advance beyond Argentan. Armored spearheads moved rapidly along multiple road networks toward the Dives River and the Trun-Chambois corridor. German resistance in these sectors consisted primarily of disorganized infantry groups, ad hoc motorized detachments, and intermittent armored elements lacking sufficient fuel for sustained combat. The advancing American units encountered extensive battlefield congestion. German vehicle columns, retreating under air attack, abandoned hundreds of trucks, artillery pieces, and damaged armored vehicles along roadways. Bridges across small rivers and drainage channels became choke points for both retreating German convoys and advancing Allied formations. These bottlenecks produced localized firefights that disrupted movement, but did not halt the overall Allied advance. Air operations reached their highest density during this phase. Allied fighter bombers conducted continuous interdiction against retreating German columns throughout daylight hours. Road junctions, bridges, and known staging areas were targeted repeatedly. German withdrawal movements were forced almost entirely into nighttime to limit exposure, further reducing the speed and coordination of escape. Civilian populations remained trapped inside the proximity of the emerging pocket. Towns such as Falaise, Trun, and surrounding villages were subjected to repeated artillery bombardment and airstrikes, as both sides contested control of transit routes. Civilian evacuation was largely impossible due to the speed of operations and the destruction of transport infrastructure. Agricultural land was heavily damaged by armor movement and shell fire, contributing to widespread displacement. By 15th August, the German withdrawal corridor had been reduced to a narrow arc extending roughly from Trun through Chambois toward the east. Inside this zone remained significant elements of the German 7th Army and parts of the 5th Panzer Army. The gap between advancing Allied forces was now measured in tens rather than hundreds of kilometers. However, complete encirclement had not yet been achieved. German command continued to divert remaining mobile units into the corridor to hold key elevations and road junctions. These actions bought limited time for withdrawal, but further concentrated German troops, vehicles, and equipment into an increasingly congested battle space. The engagements of this phase established the physical structure of the Falaise pocket. The battlefield was no longer defined by a continuous front line, but by a tightening ring of pressure around a collapsing evacuation route. From this point forward, every movement inside the corridor would be conducted under fire, and the margin for coordinated withdrawal would narrow sharply with each passing day. From 16th to 18th August 1944, the battle entered a phase of escalation marked by mounting losses, command fragmentation, and severe congestion within the narrowing German withdrawal corridor. The operational problem for the German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army shifted from coordinated retreat to crisis management under constant interdiction. At the same time, the Allied advance increased in tempo, driven by the recognition that the opportunity for a decisive encirclement was approaching its critical window. German rearguard formations were now forced to operate under extreme pressure. Infantry units drawn from depleted divisions attempted to hold successive blocking positions along ridgelines and village clusters west and south of Troon. These forces lacked adequate anti-tank weapons and artillery support, relying instead on limited numbers of self-propelled guns and assault guns operating with minimal fuel reserves. Once these positions were bypassed or neutralized, there were few organized formations remaining to establish new defensive lines. Inside the withdrawal corridor, movement became increasingly chaotic. Thousands of vehicles, ranging from horse-drawn wagons to armored carriers, converged on the same narrow road network. Fuel shortages forced repeated abandonment of transport and heavy weapons. Artillery batteries destroyed their own guns after exhausting towing capacity or ammunition stockpiles. Traffic jams extended for kilometers, creating densely packed targets vulnerable to artillery fire and air attack. Allied air forces applied continuous pressure throughout daylight hours. Fighter bombers targeted road junctions, river crossings, and vehicle concentrations with rockets, bombs, and cannon fire. German attempts to disperse into fields and wooded areas reduced some losses, but increased abandonment of vehicles that could not be concealed or moved under air threat. Night movement partially restored evacuation flow, but intensified congestion at dawn when convoys were forced to halt. At the operational level, Allied commanders faced growing coordination challenges of their own. The expanding American advance east of Argentan brought U.S. armored units into the proximity of Canadian and Polish forces advancing from the north. Differences in command boundaries, radio compatibility, and tactical objectives complicated rapid linkage. Temporary operational pauses were imposed in some sectors to avoid fratricide and to realign unit axes, slowing full closure of the pocket. German command structures deteriorated sharply during this period. Communications between Army Group B headquarters and forward units became intermittent due to destroyed signal lines and constant movement. Senior commanders received incomplete or outdated reports regarding the location and status of formations. Decision-making increasingly devolved to corps and divisional levels, where unit leaders improvised withdrawal routes without broader coordination. Political interference further complicated German operations. Hitler continued to issue restrictive directives emphasizing the holding of specific localities rather than flexible disengagement. These orders conflicted directly with battlefield requirements and forced some formations to delay withdrawal beyond viable timeframes, increasing the number of troops trapped inside the forming pocket. Civilian suffering intensified as combat concentrated around major transit routes. Towns and villages along the corridor were subjected to continuous artillery and air bombardment. Civilian casualties rose as individuals attempting to flee across open terrain encountered active fire zones. Medical services for non-combatants collapsed entirely within the pocket zone. By August 18th, the geometric shape of the pocket had become clearly defined. The Allied northern and southern forces were now separated by a gap of less than 20 kilometers centered on the Troon-Chambois axis. German forces inside this space remained numerically significant, but were increasingly deprived of operational coherence, heavy equipment, and fuel. The crisis phase had fully emerged. The German field armies faced not merely defeat, but the imminent risk of mass destruction through encirclement. What remained unresolved was whether the remaining escape corridor could be held open long enough to permit a substantial portion of German manpower to withdraw eastward, or whether the tightening Allied ring would close before that movement could be completed. Between August 18th and 20th, 1944, the battle reached its peak as both sides committed their remaining mobile forces to determine the fate of the encircled German formations. The narrowing corridor between Chambois and Mont-Ormel became the focal point of the entire campaign. This strip of terrain, in places less than 3 kilometers wide, was the only remaining route for organized German withdrawal. Into this confined space flowed remnants of multiple divisions, along with columns of wounded support units and civilian traffic still trapped in the combat zone. The German command now concentrated its remaining armored strength on protecting and widening the corridor. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division's Das Reich, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, and parts of the 116th Panzer Division were pulled together into improvised battle groups. These formations operated with reduced tank numbers and critically limited fuel supplies. Several units reported fewer than 15 operational armored vehicles. Their primary mission was to conduct localized counterattacks against Canadian and Polish units pressing toward Chambois from the north and American formations advancing from the south. On 19 August, Canadian and Polish forces intensified their advance toward the closing point. The 1st Polish Armored Division, operating under the Canadian First Army, pushed toward the high ground around Mont-Ormel. This terrain feature dominated the surrounding countryside and offered observation over the withdrawal corridor. Simultaneously, American forces moved north from the Argentan sector. Though uneven terrain, scattered German resistance, and coordination limits between Allied commands slowed the final convergence. The battle for Mont-Ormel became one of the most critical engagements of the entire pocket. Polish armored units reached the ridge and established defensive positions under immediate counterattack. German forces launched repeated assaults supported by remaining tanks, assault guns, and concentrated artillery fire. These clashes unfolded at short range, often within less than 1,000 meters, with limited room for maneuver. The Polish defenders faced sustained pressure while operating under shortage of ammunition and medical evacuation capacity. Inside the corridor itself, the flow of German withdrawal intensified to its maximum density. Columns of infantry moved on foot beside immobilized vehicles. Injured soldiers were carried on makeshift stretchers or abandoned in the roadside ditches when evacuation became impossible. German artillery units fired remaining ammunition in direct support roles before disabling their weapons. The concentration of manpower and equipment created an environment of near constant exposure to artillery fire and fighter-bomber attack. Allied air power continued systematic interdiction throughout daylight hours. Air reconnaissance identified movement corridors and directed repeated strike packages against bridge crossings and road junctions. German attempts to move armored vehicles under cover of smoke screens had limited effect, as terrain and congestion restricted dispersion. Losses from air attacks increased sharply during this period, particularly among soft-skinned transport vehicles carrying fuel and ammunition. At the same time, Allied ground commanders faced decisions of major operational consequence. The question was no longer whether the German armies west of Paris would be defeated, but whether they would be destroyed as coherent forces. Canadian and American commanders had to balance the urgency of closing the corridor against the risks of overextension, friendly fire, and German breakout strikes against exposed flanks. The civilian population experienced one of the most severe phases of the campaign during these days. Entire villages within the corridor were subjected to continuous shelling and air attack. Shelters collapsed under repeated impacts, and local medical infrastructure ceased to function. Civilian casualties mounted as individuals attempted to escape through fields exposed to observation and fire. By the end of 20th August, the engagement had entered its decisive stage. The withdrawal corridor remained barely open, but its width fluctuated by the hour under pressure from converging Allied advances and repeated German counterattacks. The battle had reached its highest level of intensity. The fate of tens of thousands of troops and the outcome of the Western Front's summer campaign now hinged on the outcome of fighting across a few kilometers of contested ground. From 20th to 21st August 1944, the battle entered its most compressed and destructive phase. The remaining German forces trapped inside the pocket attempted a final coordinated breakout, while Allied formations pressed steadily inward from all directions. The withdrawal corridor narrowed to a series of contested roads and field tracks running between Chambois, Coudhard, and the slopes of Mont-Ormel. In several sectors, the distance between opposing Allied positions was reduced to less than 2 kilometers. German breakout efforts during this phase were organized around successive waves of infantry, supported by the remaining armored vehicles and assault guns. These attacks were not designed to defeat Allied forces, but to rupture local blocking positions long enough for retreating columns to pass through. Units were committed without regard for unit integrity, drawing together remnants of panzer grenadiers, artillery crews, logistics personnel, and wounded soldiers into mixed assault formations. The heaviest fighting centered on Mont-Ormel, where Polish armored and infantry units maintained control of the dominant ridgeline overlooking the corridor. German counterattacks were launched repeatedly against these positions using concentrated artillery fire, followed by short-range armored thrusts. Several engagements occurred at distances under 500 meters, where tank guns, anti-tank weapons, and machine guns operated in direct line-of-sight combat. Polish units suffered severe ammunition shortages and casualty accumulation, yet retained control of the ridge throughout the critical period. Inside the corridor, withdrawal degenerated into a continuous movement of scattered groups rather than organized formations. Infantry moved on foot across fields under artillery fire, often abandoning road networks entirely when congestion became impassable. Vehicle columns disintegrated into immobilized clusters of destroyed trucks, artillery tractors, and ammunition wagons. Fuel shortages eliminated any possibility of coordinated mechanized escape. Allied artillery established overlapping fire zones across the remaining exit routes. Forward observers guided sustained barrages onto known crossing points and road intersections. The density of fire increased significantly during the night of the 20th to the 21st of August as German commanders attempted to move major concentrations under darkness. These movements were repeatedly detected and disrupted by illumination rounds and pre-registered firing sequences. Air operations resumed at dawn on the 21st of August with maximum intensity. Fighter-bomber formations attacked retreating columns concentrated in exposed low ground. The lack of concealment and mobility inside the pocket made evasion nearly impossible. Losses among transport and support units expanded rapidly during these hours, further reducing the survivability of retreating formations. For Allied ground commanders, the priority became sealing the final gaps without creating exposure to German counterthrusts. Canadian and American units coordinated incremental advances rather than deep thrusts to avoid the risk of isolated forward elements being overrun. This deliberate method slowed the pace of closure, but reduced the likelihood of German forces breaking through via localized counterattacks. Civilian populations caught inside the pocket experienced extreme conditions during this phase. Numerous civilians remained sheltering in cellars and farm buildings within the withdrawal routes. Many were forced into the open by fire, collapse, or advancing armor. Casualties among non-combatants rose sharply as artillery fire swept across inhabited areas, with little distinction between military and civilian concentrations. By the end of 21st August, only fragmented escape routes remained open to the east. German breakout attempts continued, but the corridor no longer functioned as a coherent evacuation channel. The remaining German presence inside the pocket consisted primarily of disorganized groups lacking heavy weapons, medical support, or centralized command. The battle had transitioned from an operational encirclement into a terminal crisis measured in hours rather than days. By 22nd August 1944, the operational structure of the encirclement collapsed entirely. What remained inside the Falaise pocket was no longer a coherent fighting force, but a mosaic of isolated groups attempting individual escape. Communications between German units were largely severed. Field radios were destroyed, abandoned, or lacked power. Command authority fragmented down to company or even squad level, and in many sectors, control no longer extended beyond visual range. The last organized defensive effort focused along the Dives River crossings and the final road segments east of Chambois. German rearguard elements established temporary blocking positions using remaining anti-tank guns, machine guns, and improvised infantry barricades. These positions were not intended for sustained resistance, but to delay Allied advances for several hours at a time to allow additional personnel to pass through. In most cases, these delaying forces were overwhelmed within minutes by combined artillery and armored pressure. Polish forces on Mont Ormel maintained their elevated observation and fire control positions until relieved by Canadian infantry late on the 22nd of August. After nearly 3 days of continuous engagement, Polish units were nearing exhaustion. Casualty figures within some formations approached 30%. Ammunition stocks were critically depleted, and medical evacuation had been intermittent due to ongoing fire along the narrow ridge roads. East of Troon and Coudehard, Canadian and American forces completed the gradual closure of the remaining gaps through coordinated armored pushes supported by direct artillery fire. Rather than attempting rapid penetrations, Allied commanders employed methodical advances using infantry screens in front of tanks to avoid ambush by isolated German anti-tank teams. This slowed final closure, but minimized friendly losses at short ranges. Within the pocket, the condition of the trapped German forces deteriorated rapidly. Food stocks were exhausted. Water sources were contaminated by debris and casualties. Medical care for the wounded was almost non-existent. Many field dressings had been exhausted earlier in the retreat, and surgical evacuation was no longer possible. Wounded personnel were frequently left behind in barns, ditches, or wooded areas without further assistance. Captured documents recovered during this period indicated that unit strength records became meaningless. Divisions that had entered Normandy with 12,000 to 15,000 personnel now consisted of a few thousand survivors scattered across multiple locations. Equipment losses were near total for many formations, including entire artillery battalions abandoned or destroyed. The surrender process accelerated during this phase. As escape routes closed completely, German soldiers began surrendering in increasing numbers to advancing Allied infantry. These surrenders were often conducted under fire, as individuals or small groups raised improvised white flags made from clothing or bandages. Temporary prisoner collection points formed behind the advancing front lines, rapidly exceeding planned capacities. Civilian recovery operations were largely impossible during active combat closure. Villages within the pocket remained hazardous due to unexploded ordnance, burning vehicles, and collapsed structures. Livestock losses were widespread. Numerous roadways remained blocked by debris fields several meters deep in destroyed vehicles, equipment, and fallen infrastructure. By the evening of the 22nd of August, the pocket existed only as disconnected fragments under constant Allied fire control. No functional evacuation corridor remained. German forces still inside were either engaged in isolated resistance in the process of surrender or attempting improvised escape on foot through forested terrain eastward. The operational battle for the encirclement had ended. What followed was the systematic absorption of remaining resistance and the consolidation of Allied control over the former pocket area. Following the dissolution of organized resistance within the former encirclement, Allied forces transitioned from combat operations to large-scale clearance, prisoner processing, and stabilization of the devastated area. Between 23rd and 25th August 1944, tens of thousands of German soldiers were collected as prisoners of war across the former pocket zone. Estimates compiled by Allied headquarters indicated that approximately 40,000 to 50,000 personnel were captured during this final phase, while an additional 20,000 to 30,000 had managed to escape eastward without heavy equipment. The escapees who reached the Seine did so in fragmented condition. Most formations had lost their artillery, armor, and logistics columns. Of the 7 German divisions present in the pocket during the final collapse, none retained coherent regimental structure afterward. Armored formations such as the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division reached the river with only a few dozen operational vehicles combined. Fuel shortages and systematic Allied air interdiction eliminated nearly all vehicular transport during the breakout. German rear area command networks attempted to reassemble defensive screens along the Seine between Elbeuf, Rouen, and Vernal. These emergency formations consisted largely of infantry remnants, headquarters staff, and retreating repair units. The lack of heavy weapons severely limited their ability to conduct delaying actions. Bridge demolitions occurred sporadically, but lacked coordination. Several key crossings fell intact to advancing Allied reconnaissance elements in the days that followed. Within the former pocket zone, humanitarian conditions stabilized only gradually. The density of destroyed equipment and casualties created critical sanitation challenges. The Normandy summer heat accelerated decomposition, and water contamination became widespread along streams and low-lying terrain. Allied engineering units were tasked with road clearance under hazardous conditions due to unexploded ordnance, damaged ammunition vehicles, and unstable wreckage. Clearance operations continued into September in some sectors. Civilian displacement reached its peak during this phase. French authorities recorded that several thousand residents from the villages of Troon, Chambois, Côte-Hard, and surrounding hamlets were rendered homeless. Agricultural losses were severe. Over half of the livestock population in some cantons was destroyed or scattered. Recovery agriculture would not resume at scale until the spring of 1945 due to soil contamination and infrastructure damage. The immediate military consequence of the pocket's collapse was the removal of organized German resistance in western Normandy. This opened the operational corridor for Allied forces to conduct rapid advances across northern France. By early September, Allied spearheads had crossed the Seine on a broad front. Paris was liberated on August 25th. German command in the west lost the capacity to establish a continuous defensive line until the formation of positions near the German frontier several weeks later. German casualty accounting from the battle remained incomplete due to the fragmented nature of the retreat. Post-war estimates indicate between 10,000 and 15,000 personnel killed within the pocket during the closure phase, with total losses including prisoners and missing exceeding 70,000 from the Normandy campaign's concluding operations. For Allied forces, the aftermath involved logistical restructuring as forward supply depots were repositioned toward the Seine and beyond. The rapid pace of advance created fuel and transport strains that temporarily slowed operations in early September. These constraints would later influence the operational limits of Allied maneuver capacity in the autumn of 1944. By the final days of August, the Falaise area ceased to exist as an active battlefield. What remained was a dismantled zone of military collapse, marking the irreversible end of German field force cohesion in northern France and the full operational shift of the Western Front toward the German border. In the years following the battle, the Falaise pocket assumed a central position in historical assessments of the Normandy campaign and the broader collapse of German military power in Western Europe. The destruction of multiple German field formations in August 1944 permanently altered the balance of forces on the Western Front. By the end of September, German Army Group B no longer possessed the operational depth required to conduct sustained maneuver warfare west of the Rhine. The loss of experienced officers, trained non-commissioned personnel, and irreplaceable technical specialists weakened the German order of battle for the remainder of the war. From a strategic perspective, the pocket confirmed the decisive role of air superiority in modern warfare. Allied air forces demonstrated the ability to isolate a battlefield region for extended periods, disrupt logistics, and paralyze retreat routes. The systematic destruction of transport columns between Argentan and Chambois established a new model for interdiction warfare that would later be applied across occupied Europe. Post-war Allied studies identified the Falaise battles as a primary example of how air-ground coordination could eliminate an entire enemy field army without continuous frontal engagement. The battle also exposed structural limitations within the German command system. Rigid command hierarchies, delayed authorization procedures, and conflicting operational priorities between Berlin and field commands contributed to the delayed breakout and the lethal compression of forces within the pocket. Archival records reveal that multiple German corps commanders issued withdrawal requests between August 11th and 14th that were denied or postponed, leading directly to the final encirclement of approximately 80,000 personnel within the narrowing corridor. For France, the physical and social scars of the battle endured for decades. Entire villages in the Orne and Calvados regions remained partially abandoned well into the 1950s. Fields contaminated by metal fragmentation and unexploded munitions remained hazardous long after fighting ceased. French recovery authorities documented more than 1,600 destroyed civilian structures within the pocket perimeter. Infrastructure reconstruction required sustained international assistance, particularly in road and bridge systems, vital for post-war economic recovery. Commemoration of the battle developed gradually. Unlike earlier Normandy landings, the Falaise battles initially received less public attention due to the dramatic liberation of Paris shortly afterward. Formal memorialization expanded in the 1960s as surviving veterans from both sides participated in early reconciliation efforts. The Memorial de Mont-Ormel and multiple battlefield cemeteries now mark key engagement zones, housing the remains of Allied and German personnel alike. Historical debate regarding the incomplete closure of the pocket remains active within military scholarship. Some analyses argue that earlier sealing of the Chambois corridor might have captured a significantly greater portion of German forces. Others emphasize the logistical and coordination challenges faced by converging Allied formations operating with different national command structures and communication systems. Post-war studies generally agree that while the encirclement did not achieve total annihilation, it eliminated Germany's last major field force in France. In broader historical memory, the Falaise pocket stands as the operational conclusion of the Normandy campaign, rather than its initial objective. It transformed a successful amphibious landing into the irreversible collapse of German control over northern France. The destruction of equipment, manpower, and command cohesion inside the pocket ensured that the subsequent Allied advance to the German frontier would encounter resistance that was defensive, fragmented, and ultimately unsustainable. Today, the fields between Falaise, Argentan, and Chambois remain quiet agricultural land. Yet beneath the soil, fragments of the battle persist. The landscape continues to bear the invisible imprint of a decisive rupture in European military history, marking the moment when the German army in the West ceased to function as a coherent operational force and the road toward Germany itself lay open.